Hello, I'm Ron Kettleson, and I'm president of the Sharon Historical Society. We'd like to welcome you to our program, Jewish Life in Sharon Springs. We'd like to thank Henry Heinbach and Rich Brustman for their contribution to this program. Before we get started, there's just a couple of things I want to remind you of. To get the most out of this program tonight, make sure that your computer is muted. So down in the bottom left-hand corner, there's an icon that says mute. You want to make sure that you have a red line through that. And right next to that is an icon that says video. Make sure you have a red line through that as well. Up on the top of the screen, you have a little icon that says view, and you want to make sure that it says speaker. And that will prevent you from seeing a whole list of names while you're trying to watch the presentation. This program is being recorded tonight, and once it's over, you will receive a link, so you'll be able to play it back and enjoy it again later. So we'd like to welcome you once again to our program this evening called Jewish Life in Sharon Springs.
Hello, I'm Henry Heinbach, and I'm happy to be on this webinar with everyone today. I'm going to give you a little background, and since we're not far from Cooperstown, I'm going to use the analogy of being close to the last of the Mohicans, except I'm a Brustman through my mother's side of the family. My parents were both born in America. My grandparents were not. On my father's side, the family name was Heinbach, and they came from Austria. So there it was Heinbach. And on my mother's side, the family name was Brustman. And they came from a town on the Polish-Russian border called Rubyshev, or Lvov in Russian. At the time that they arrived in this country, they were on Ellis Island for a while and then relocated to the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which at that time was the most densely populated area in the world, more densely populated than Calcutta. There were so many people living on the Lower East Side that it almost seemed as if you knew your neighbor by virtue of the fact that so many people had emigrated to this country in the hopes of finding a better way of life. At that time, the Second World War brought more people in, and the Brustman family decided to explore possibilities that presented themselves through a town upstate New York that had the tradition of mineral springs bathing. The spa, of course, is Sharon Springs, and my grandmother, Dora, along with her other family members, came up in search of another way of life and found that they were receptive to us and decided to make a purchase of a home on Union Street, on the corner of Green Street. This home had been a reputed cattle pasture, and there was a barn in the back of the house and a pond on the property, and we had taken over the house and called it, with the family name, the Brustman House. In the other dwellings on Union Street, every house had at least multiple families and were also rooming houses. The rooming house was different from the boarding house in that the people who owned it did not provide meals, and the people who sought rooms there had the means to cook in their room, which had a gas-burning stove, a refrigerator, table and chairs, and a bed. And these were called kocheleins, meaning cook alone. And each of the houses on the block were owned by different families. Ours were the Brustman House, and in the Brustman House we had the Schoenfeld family, the Heinbach family, the Haber family, and all of their husbands, wives, and offspring. So the house was filled, but we still had 11 bedrooms, and so there were room for people to come and stay as guests while they went to the spa.
Hi, I'm Rich Brustman. I grew up in New York City, but spent my summers in Sharon Springs frequently as a kid. My grandmother owned a rooming house in Sharon Springs, and so that's why I would visit, and that's my connection to Sharon. Plus, over the years, I moved to Albany as an adult, and so it was within a short drive to Sharon Springs, so I was constantly going back and forth between Albany and Sharon over all these years, seeing how it transitioned and took shape as it is to now. In the 19th century, it was developed as a resort. It was basically a high-end, this is in the 1800s, 19th century, a high-end resort area with the springs. The hotels were very elaborate. Later on, they brought up rail service. There was rail service up on the top of the hill that came via Cobleskill, which then connected to New York City. It was a high-end resort town. Then in about the 1880s, there was a wave of nativism in the U.S. This was across the U.S. There was a wave of nativism, and part of it was rising anti-Semitism. And so these resorts, in particular Saratoga Springs, is a famous incident. Some very rich Jews were shunned at Saratoga Springs and told they couldn't come here. These were the equivalent of billionaire Jews, and they were shocked and everything. So this wave of anti-Semitism was taking place, and Saratoga Springs became hostile to Jews, but Sharon didn't. And so Jews tended to go towards the resorts that weren't as hostile. Sharon Springs was that. And so starting in the late 1800s, it started developing a Jewish clientele. Probably by about the 1920s, it was probably pretty much dominantly Jewish, with the waves of immigrants from Europe coming in and fueling it. And so we'll say from the 1880s to the 1920s was the transition period. And pretty much from the 1920s on, it was pretty much dominantly Jewish until, 1970s or 80s. Well, it was different back then in the 40s when I was a kid. What you had was they were basically, you had a disconnect. You have the upstaters, the Sharon people were upstaters. They tended to be Republican and conservative, anti-Roosevelt, anti-New Deal. The people from New York were Jewish, which was a different religion. There was more friction between religions then. They were basically tended to be liberal and pro-Roosevelt. So there was that kind of disconnect. So there was a mutual standoffish between the two communities. However, because commerce being commerce, you have to deal with each other. So there was sort of a working relationship, but not necessarily a social relationship.
During the course of my stay in Sharon Springs, which spanned almost 7+ decades, there were a number of changes that I saw taking place of great significance in terms of the Sharon Springs Jewish population. At some point, through natural attrition, the aging of the immigrants who had come from Nazi Germany and found respite in the town of Sharon Springs, things began to economically change. hotels changed hands, rooming houses fell into disrepair as the population of the Jewish immigrants began to dwindle. They aged, they died off, and the trip sometimes became too arduous for them to go back and forth from New York to the town. In their wake, there was a different group of Jewish people who arrived who were ultra-Orthodox and were known as Satmars. The Satmars were German refugees who escaped the Holocaust by fleeing to Hungary. And in Hungary, they managed to leave before they were imprisoned when Germany occupied Hungary. This group came to Sharon Springs much the same way as the group previously did, where they knew that they would be tolerated and also given the opportunity to participate in the mineral baths which they were used to taking. The difference with the Satmar was pretty profound from the existing Jewish community, which was dwindling. The Satmar were much more religious and ultra-Orthodox, and very frequently would not mingle with anyone other than those members of their own sect. And so they couldn't partake in the social life of the town. They couldn't go to the shops that were frequented by the previous group. And such, they often occupied their own stores run by their own group, and they observed the traditions of the Bible literally, and they began to set themselves apart from the existing local community, who could not earn an income in the same way that they were able to form financial relationships with the previous immigrants from Germany. The Satmars distinguished themselves in many ways besides being ultra-observant of the Bible. Their look was different. They wore different clothes that set them apart and often became ridiculed for the way that they appeared. They had garb that looked like they were wearing bathrobes but were sort of overcoats, and their hats were furred, possibly with beaver skin, and had extremely wide, broad rims, which made them look like chess pieces almost when they walked. They had white stockings that set them apart, so that when you saw the whole ensemble together, you kind of wondered who these strange-looking people were. They didn't attempt to communicate. They didn't attempt to integrate. In fact, when they took over a residence, they often stayed in that residence exclusively. It became their home. It became their place of worship. It became the school for their children.
Businesses grew up on Main Street that were Jewish-oriented, because the clientele at this point must have been 90% Jewish. This is just post-World War II. And I remember most of them, their clientele were Yiddish speakers. And so a lot of the signs on Main Street were Yiddish, in Yiddish. I think there, in some cases, they were more, some stores had more Yiddish than English. They emphasized, and Yiddish was a common language on Main Street, at least in the summer months. In the winter, not at all. I mentioned a lot of the signs were in Yiddish, and a lot of the clientele were primary Yiddish speakers. In fact, there were a lot of people who didn't speak English. They only spoke Yiddish. Yiddish is being the Jewish vernacular language, the Mama Lotion, they call it in Yiddish, the mother tongue. But so the stores along Main Street would be, the newsstands. There would be newsstands and candy stores, and they would have, in those days, you'd have a bench in front of the store, and all the various newspapers would be lined up outside the store, and you could pick up a newspaper and drop a nickel or whatever the thing was, there was a sort of early self-help thing. This was pretty common through New York City or everywhere. This was a common thing. But the thing that struck me was that half the newspapers were Yiddish newspapers. They were foreign language newspapers. And, in addition to being able to buy the New York News or the Daily Mirror, you could also buy the Forwards and the Tag and the other Yiddish, papers published in Yiddish. So it was sort of like a little international, these newsstands were a little international flavor.
A person like myself, who was an assimilated Jew, could shop anywhere. On Main Street, any place that I went seemed to not be prescribed against shopping there. Often, the less orthodox Lubavitchers could operate in some shops that were run by Orthodox Jews, and one of them was named Mrs. Gudalievich, who had a grocery store very close to the Historical Society Museum. However, the Satmar were restricted to having their own grocery store run by people from their own sect, and they often were located very close to the synagogue and operated exclusively for the Satmar's benefit. In an attempt to provide additional services, the Sharon Springs population often had local stores that would cater to the Jewish residents, and a kosher butcher on Main Street run by Heinbach sold meat that was able to be purchased because it was prepared in the traditional way that was acceptable to Orthodox Jews. Other establishments had a library that was further on down the street, and Jews would often select reading materials, which sometimes included books written in Yiddish that were available to them, as well as newspapers. Harry Gorell ran a taxi stand and sold newspapers in buildings that were very close to the Columbia and also to the Historical Society Museum. Harry Gorell provided transportation for Jewish families coming up to enter rooming houses or the hotels, and to return people who were finished with their stay in Sharon, and often would employ local individuals to ferry the travelers to and from New York City. At the same time, the town had their bank as well as their post office located directly across from Berman's little village, which had a huge swimming pool and bungalow colonies and took up the entire site, now used as the concert area and the Collegiate Temple. Further down the block, we had a bakery set up for consumption using kosher products to make bread. The townspeople of Sharon Springs often were providing food for the dietary needs of the Jewish population, and frequently farmers would come around with produce and were selling vegetables and other things to the boarders who were residents in the rooming houses. Ezra Cummings would load up his truck with his farm produce like corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and beans and peppers, and park in front of the house and say, "Corn!" And once the kids heard that, they would pick up the chant, "Corn! Corn!" And everybody would start coming out of the houses because they knew Ezra had arrived and they were able to replenish their supply of fresh produce. Another group that came to sell products were the Olibrick Milk and Dairy Farm. They brought fresh milk and would deliver on a weekly basis bottles that had such rich milk that the cream would often separate and float to the top. To enjoy the milk, you had to shake the bottles up, holding down the paper caps tightly so that the cream would mix with the milk. At the end of the week, the empty bottles would be returned and full bottles would be replaced. Another source of food from the town was a poultry farmer. I believe Cousineau might have been the last name, and they brought eggs in paper cartons and sold them to the roomers and the residents on Union Street. In this way, the financial relationship strengthened between the Sharon Springs entrepreneurs and the recipients of the produce that was provided by the town. At some point, as the population of Jews in Sharon Springs increased, they were represented to a greater extent by the numbers of Holocaust survivors who had come from the concentration camps in Germany, where they were tortured and beaten in an attempt to exterminate them. They were tattooed and identified as a group set apart for annihilation. At the end of the Second World War, Germany paid reparations to this group, which allowed them to emigrate to the United States, where they found their way to Sharon Springs through word of mouth. Sharon Springs was seen to be a place that tolerated the Jewish community, and so they began to arrive and stayed at the Adler, the Columbia, the rooming houses on Union Street, and in general sought the healing mineral springs of the Imperial Baths as therapy for the ails that were inflicted on them when they were in Europe. The town had set up services to accommodate people at the baths, and often they were given massages by the local people who were employed by the Imperial Baths and the White Sulphur Spring Company. They were also assisted in their bathing rituals by the same people who got to know them intimately, and slowly a grudging respect was given to these victims who were seen by the local people as people not to be discriminated against. And so a tolerance for their presence and a respect, a mutual respect, was gained. And through this interaction based on a financial arrangement, the town increased by thousands as time went by, so that the economic presence of the German Jews had an impact on the town, and the town thrived during the summer. As the Jewish population in the town of Sharon Springs aged, it became increasingly difficult for them to make the journey from New York City to Sharon Springs and to return. There was also an element among the younger Jewish people that didn't have the same faith in the healing properties of the mineral waters and had less interest in partaking of the healing powers of the sulfur springs. And so, because there wasn't as many people attending each summer, the rooming houses could not sustain their territory, and their homes had to be sold or abandoned, and many of them caught fire and burned while others fell into disrepair. And eventually the economic situation became more serious as the advent of Saratoga Springs began to attract more affluent clientele that in the past might have associated with Sharon and the Jewish population. Saratoga did not welcome Jewish people, and so they further were restricted in their access to places like Sharon Springs where they could vacation for a summer season.
Cultural and demographic forces. For one thing, after World War II, all sorts of new opportunities for the summer vacations opened up rather than retreating to a village. Now, airline travel became more common. People were more prosperous, so they would take more expensive and more exotic vacations. So, I mean, it wasn't just Sharon Springs was drying up. The Catskills, even Saratoga was going on bad times for a while. Just basically a lot of these little resorts, people escaping the cities, were declining. Also, there were generational changes. I mentioned before, the clientele, European-born clientele, from the immigration era, when people immigrated, they were a lot of European-born clientele. They believed in baths. This is their idea of a vacation. The younger generation, the post-World War II, they don't believe in the baths. They don't. They have more exotic choices for vacation. They have access to cars. Remember, most of the people who came to Sharon Springs came by bus or taxi. People didn't have cars then, and so after the war, new opportunities. Plus, the housing stock in Sharon was declining. Very much. It was becoming an age, resort. It was becoming less de Class A, so it was attracting a clientele that, was accordingly less prosperous.
The Central Hotel, operated by Harry Cutler for many years, once Harry died, it changed hands. It changed hands probably a little before Harry passed away, when the family sold it to an ultra-Orthodox religious Jewish group called the Satmars. The Satmars were originally from Germany and were probably the most Orthodox of all of the Hasidim, which included the Lubavitchers, and they were rescued from Germany to Hungary, where they enjoyed a period of time to worship freely. However, when Germany invaded Hungary, they became very anxious to leave and to emigrate. There were thousands and thousands of Satmar trying to escape Germany all at the same time, along with many other Hungarian Jews that were not of the Satmar sect. One of the Israeli entrepreneurs that lived in Germany was able to bribe an SS Gestapo chief to allow the Jews to leave and go to Switzerland on a train, and then from Switzerland to come to Sharon Springs. At that time in Hungary, during the escape, there was a religious Satmar leader called Joel Teitelbaum. And Joel Teitelbaum led his group successfully to Sharon Springs, where they came and dwelled for a number of years, using the Central Hotel as a synagogue and a yeshiva. It also housed a grocery store, and they could maintain their dietary restrictions, which were not easily done in the town. They also had ultra-Orthodox observance of the Sabbath.
They sold it. The Cutler family got out of the business, I think, in the mid-50s and sold it to the Satmar. Whoever owned it in the Satmar in the late 50s and convinced Joel Teitelbaum to come and visit, and he'd be a regular. He'd visit each summer, and of course he's almost a worshipful figure among these people. So this made that Central Hotel very important to the Satmar, because if Joel Teitelbaum would go there, it must be, the best. And so there was a kind of reverence for that hotel by the Satmar. It was owned by, I don't remember their names. It was owned by a family who I thought were very old. And they were Holocaust survivors. And to my shock, what I thought was an old woman, one day I see her pregnant. And later on she had kids, and they would grow up, and I suddenly realized this was the toll of the concentration camps. These people were maybe 20 or 30 years old. I thought they were 50 or 60. I was a little kid, so maybe not that discerning, but so that was why I was shocked when they were pregnant. I thought they were past that age, but they had the thing for a while, the hotel for a while they owned, and the Teitelbaums would visit. And in fact, I think the last time that the Central Hotel, and I remember maybe as late as in the 90s, they actually had people in that hotel. They were hanging on, and people would come on a Jewish holiday to honor Teitelbaum, even though Teitelbaum was long passed away. But at some point, as you know, the hotel was abandoned and was falling apart. It was never well maintained after the Satmar took over, but the collapse or the decay was accelerating by the 90s beyond habitation.
On the Sabbath, the ultra-Orthodox Satmar were not allowed to work, and more specifically, they couldn't even carry things, and their interpretation of work often involved everyday functions such as turning light switches on and off, or starting a flame in a stove so that they could cook. For that purpose, they often employed the services of non-Jewish people in the town or in the village that would help them. And they would come in, do what was necessary, like turning on their lights or turning them off, starting and stopping their flames from the stove, and basically moving things so that they could accommodate them in their day-to-day activities. They often strung wire or fishing line from the porches of their homes out to the street and behind the house as well, to allow them room to bring things to and from the kitchen, the bedroom, the synagogue, and other areas. As young teenagers, the activities that we shared between the Jewish residents and the local residents of Sharon Springs created a bond that lasted more than just the summer. And each year, as time would go by, we would look forward to renewing the acquaintances with the friends that we had made through the day camp and other shared activities. As a young boy growing up in Sharon being exposed to a culture that was very different in many ways, socio-economically and physically. The local residents of Sharon Springs appeared different to me. Many of the children had white hair like corn silk, and as adults, the women often looked like, not like the Jewish people. The Jewish people were darker and very frequently had beards. And as you looked at the different hotels, they seemed to cater to a different socioeconomic class, with the more wealthy, affluent Jews staying at the Adler and the Columbia, and the less well-off would often occupy the rooming houses. One of the exceptions in the village was the Parkview Hotel, located directly across from the White Sulphur Springs Park. There you could see elderly women who were more of the local establishment than of the Jewish establishment. And the contrast was interesting to me as a young person growing up. The only comparison that I could make was when I would be in New York, I'd go to a place called Schrafft's and see pretty much the same physical resemblance to the people in Sharon Springs. In Schrafft's, the women gathered and had tea or coffee and ordered something like Nestle Road pie, which I learned was sort of an exotic form of meringue with different bits of, I guess, hard dried candy in it. And I always expected Nestle Road pie to be served at the hotel across from Sharon's Sulphur Springs, but it never was.
Sharon Springs used to have concerts. This was in the 40s and 50s, a weekly concert on one day afternoon in the week, and they would use the front of the baths as sort of the bandstand, and the crowds would spread right out into Route 10, Main Street, and there would be seats, folding chairs and stuff. They would attract quite a crowd, maybe a few hundred people. So that was my main association with the baths. Also, the sulfur water temple there, of course, to me, especially as a kid, was endless fascination. The taste of the water, daring people to drink that water. So we would always take a visit. It was one of the hangouts as kids walked around the village.
In appreciation for all that the town did for us in the village, we often tried to patronize many of the establishments that were run by local individuals. We had the Hotel Hollywood, which was a wonderful restaurant owned and operated by Jimmy Bowmaker. And many of the times our family would dress up and go up the hill and have a wonderful dinner there. We also would use the Link family's gas station, where Stewart's is now, and meet their family. They had Eddie, Scott, and Edie Link, who were among our peers in age group, and we socialized together. Additionally, we were seen not as typical Jews to the local people, who often had a perception of the Jews who came from Germany as victims of the Holocaust. Around the time that I was 14 and becoming very motivated to work, the Greyhound bus would actually stop at a place in Sharon Springs, across the street from the Imperial Baths and the Parkview Hotel. The bus would often deposit 20, 30, 40 or more visitors each month. And my grandmother would send me to the bus stop so that I could approach our prospective residents and ask them if they had a place to stay. Most often they were looking for rooms but hadn't reserved any. And so I would carry their luggage to the Brustman House, thereby getting people to stay at our place and enjoy the company of the other guests that were already there, having arrived from previous bus trips. To give you an idea of the way things were when we first moved in, we were different families, each investing in properties in a very close proximity to one another. My mother's cousin operated the New Brighton, which was at the corner of Willow and Union, while my uncle, my mother's brother, married the daughter of the owner of the Wellington and also of the White House. It was the same person. And the families grew closer and expanded into other areas. On Division Street, we had a family who operated a place called Helen's Cozy Cottages for many years, and whose children were amateur entertainers and would perform at the Adler. Over the years, the Jewish clientele changed, and in the beginning, when our family first moved to Sharon Springs, it was 1944, and I was 2 years old, but I hadn't made my first appearance until I was 6, and at that time, Sharon was a different world to me. It taught me so many things that I've only read about in books, and it became a very, very wonderful place for a young person to spend time. And for the next 70 years, I would spend at least a summer each year in Sharon. The town was vibrant and had so many different ways that children could amuse themselves. The swimming hole was a very big mud hole, and we'd all have a great time splashing around in it. Over the years, the health department asked that it be paved, and so it became paved over at half the size, and a lifeguard was hired, and we all used to congregate up there on a hot afternoon after a game of kick the can or ball or some sort of athletic activity up at the school. We'd change into bathing suits, which were in the golf club's locker, and at that time there was an active 9-hole golf course. As a kid, I remember looking for opportunities to work and would carry the bags for some golfer up and down, and of course going downhill was easier than coming back up. So that wasn't something I really enjoyed doing for very long. But as a teenager, I was able to get my working papers with my parents' approval at age 14, and had a job in the Columbia where I was taught how to be a busboy. Unfortunately, nobody mentioned that I had to put a napkin down on the tray before I loaded it up with glasses. And when I went through the swinging door on my first day, during the first hour that I was there, the tray knocked all the glasses out of my hand, and unfortunately the salad lady tossed the salad high enough in the air while screaming, "Get rid of him," that I became known as 20-Minute Henry after Mr. Bramson, who was nice enough to give me that opportunity, met with me and told me I was a little too clumsy, called me in front of him told me that his mother was the salad lady and that he was going to have to let me go, even though I just started 20 minutes ago. I was cut from the glass. I was standing very embarrassed, and when I left, all my friends said, "What happened?" I said, "Well, I got fired." He said, "You got fired? You just started working there." I said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, 20-minute Henry, welcome." So after that, I said, "Well, I'm going to take a different job." And I went to work in Denike's bakery. And I had to be there at 6 in the morning. I never forgot the smell of baking bread. And I thought, wow, this is such a wonderful place to be. And Mrs. Deneke was a very gentle woman who kind of taught me how to use the bread slicer. And mercifully, I learned it without any particular trauma. I also learned how to operate the cash register, and my primary job was to wait on customers that wanted bread and slice it for them, and then take the money, ring it up on the register, and go on to the next person. I loved that job, and I remember after getting paid for the first time, I had a whole quarter in my pocket, and I bought a bag of Wise potato chips, the large size. And I went walking down the street thinking, I'm going to always have a quarter in my pocket, so anytime I want potato chips, I'll be able to get some. As time went by, I became interested in smoking. I guess it was a rite of passage for 14 and 15-year-olds, something to do. And I remember looking at the racks of cigarette packs that were above my head behind the slicer, and I reached in and grabbed a pack of Salem, thinking that nobody noticed because it was still early. The Denekes were in the back baking the bread, and no customers were coming in the store at that time. So I pocketed the Salem, and on my break, I went up to the pool area, lit up a Salem, inhaled it, and as anybody can tell you, on the first time they inhaled a cigarette, they coughed their lungs out. And I didn't quite understand the attraction, but I kept the cigarettes. I went back to work, and at the end of the day, Mrs. Deneke came over to me, and she said, Henry, don't smoke. And that was it. And I said, oh my God, she saw me take the cigarettes. And I thought, this woman is really wonderful. She just told me something instead of arresting me. And I walked out thinking, I learned a life lesson, that you can get more with a kind word than you can with a threat. At this point, things started to happen more quickly. I became interested in young girls, not that young, my age and older, and we started socializing in groups. And one of the things that was really wonderful about the service that the town provided was they had something called an ice cream social, and that took place in the Imperial Baths. Sofa Park, and there they had music and of course ice cream, and it was a place to meet and greet your friends and make new friends and acquaintances. And I just loved the idea that the town did that for its residents, and we mingled with the townies as well as the village people, and everybody seemed to just enjoy being there together. Another really nice thing that I remember seeing and experiencing was the concerts that would go on the steps of the Imperial Baths. Mr. Stoddard, the music teacher, brought his orchestra down to Main Street, and chairs were set up in the street. Among the boarding houses that were on Union Street, there were larger Jewish hotels that were owned by assimilated Jewish Americans. The Columbia Hotel was owned by a principal in New York City named Bramson, and he and his family operated the establishment for decades. And across from him was Dr. Freilich, who was the physician in the Imperial Baths for a while, and he also was a first-generation American assimilated. And among other Jewish hotel owners was the people who owned the Adler. Mr. Adler and Mrs. Adler were probably the biggest hotel operators in Sharon after the Pavilion closed. Each of these hotels were operated by Jewish families, and they were the ones who often provided much of the entertainment during the evening hours. The rooming houses had their own individual groups. Next to the Brustman House was the Central Hotel, which was owned by a Jewish immigrant named Harry Cutler. And Harry could play the accordion, and each evening you could hear the accordion among many other instruments that were offered as entertainment from each of the hotels. The Washington Hotel was opposite the Columbia, and they had their own house band, as did the Columbia. The entertainment that was prevalent in every one of the hotels, the Adler Hotel had an extra added attraction of running an amateur night. And a lot of the patrons of these hotels and their family members became the audience, and they danced, they sang, and they participated in doing improvisational imitations of famous people who were known at the time, like Eddie Cantor and Al Jolson. Along with the Roseboro, that also had a ballroom and music. Music came out of each place in its own individual way. One of my fondest memories is as a younger person walking through the town during the height of the season and passing by places that took a lot of our time and entertained us, such as the movie theater. Every so often the pictures would be first-run movies, and we would congregate in the theater, and it would always have a musical short preceding the main feature, and that was called Smalley's Movie Theater, and is now Klinkart Hall. We used to have some very enthusiastic kids that would follow the bouncing ball as we'd sing along to the short, and one young lady always outdid everybody else until we all stopped and just listened to her sing, and it was not particularly melodious, but it was very amusing. Next to the movie theater, I remember there being a luncheonette called Berman's, and Berman's was part of a larger establishment that was called Berman's Little Village, and it was situated in the area where the park is now, the Collegiate, and the concerts are held. And believe it or not, that entire park was the site of an enormous swimming pool. It just went and occupied all of that area. And alongside the swimming pool was bungalows that people could stay in as either boarders or roomers. And in front on Main Street was the Luncheonette. And we would congregate as kids in the Luncheonette because it had a jukebox. And we would listen to the latest 50s records like Bebop-a-Lula, She's My Baby. And all of the kids would love that. I remember going swimming just once because I think the swimming pool either got condemned or just got torn down. And I remember swimming down to the other end and looking back, and the street seemed so far away. But I never forgot that. Next to Berman's little village, as we continue going north, there were many small shops, and among them was a costume jewelry place that seemed to be sandwiched in between Denecke's Bakery on one side and Minnie Schiller's larger luncheonette on the other side. And the guy who ran the costume jewelry shop was sort of an interesting character. He was already an elderly man, but was not of the Orthodox Jewish persuasion. And so he could work, any day of the week. It didn't bother him. And one of the things he would do, as I recall, would be take a pinch of snuff from a tobacco tin that he kept in his pocket, and after sniffing from both nostrils, would walk along Main Street, and when he got tired, he'd just lay down on a bench and fall asleep. And everybody would tell you, oh, don't bother Izzy, he's sleeping. So people knew him as Tiffany, but his real name was Izzy. And I've mentioned Minnie Schiller. I worked in that luncheonette along with a few other places. And what I learned to do there was to scoop ice cream. And I also would play their I guess it's a 9-pin automatic bowling game. It was like a pinball machine that allowed you to slide a heavy hockey puck made of steel down an alleyway, and as it rolled over raised iron things that stuck up out of the alley, it would depress it, and the pin right above it would go up and stay in place so that it was possible to get a strike if you rolled it over one of those iron things. And it could occupy your time endlessly. The game had sawdust on it, and I think it was a nickel to play. And you could win free games, which I always liked to try to do. They had other pinball machines that I'm not going to bore you with, except to say that a car auto race could also produce like your name up in lights as the high scorer, and if you had a high score, you got to get a few free games. I got told by Minnie when I was scooping ice cream not to make the scoops so large, but to use smaller scoopers and come out with a smaller cone. But when my friends would come in, I'd sort of forget what she told me, and she'd always manage to remind me. So that was one of the things that I learned. I also learned the meaning of the word Vichy. When somebody came in and asked for Vichy water, I went diving under the counter in the refrigerated lockers to come up with a bottle that said Vichy on it. And I'd hand her the bottle, and she'd say, "That's not what I want." I said, "Well, it says Vichy." She says, "Yes, but I mean seltzer." And I said, "Oh, you mean what you get when you put the fountain to the other end and it doesn't come out with flavor, it just comes out with clear, bubbling water?" She says, "Yeah, that's what I mean." So I learned Vichy, I learned scooping, and I learned how to try not to get fired when I took special care of my friends.
Talk about the Smith MP Smith building that was.
Okay. Along with Minnie and Berman's Luncheonettes, there was a really large establishment, Smith MP Smith, run by two families, the Hayes family that operated a soda fountain counter, and the Papati family that operated dry goods. And together they operated a single establishment, so that if you went, when you walked in to the left, you were in the dry goods area, and if you went to the right, you could sit at a chair and have a soda or an ice cream sundae, and you were able to just enjoy a soda fountain. For many years, they operated in unison, and their offspring did different things around the town as well. I think the Hayes family were larger and had about 4 or 5 offspring that did different things, like working in a beauty parlor or driving a truck or managing some sort of other establishment. Along with Minnie and Berman's Luncheonettes, there was a really large establishment, Smith MP Smith, run by two families, the Hayes family that operated a soda fountain counter, and the Papati family that operated dry goods. And together they operated a single establishment, so that if you went, when you walked in to the left, you were in the dry goods area, and if you went to the right, you could sit at a chair and have a soda or an ice cream sundae, and you were able to just enjoy a soda fountain. For many years, they operated in unison, and their offspring did different things around the town as well. I think the Hayes family were larger and had about 4 or 5 offspring that did different things, like working in a beauty parlor or driving a truck or managing some sort of other establishment.
We had good memories. It's a nice place. It's an interesting place, even in its decrepitude. It's always been interesting and, colorful place. So that's it. There's that family association that I hope will continue for more, but it's getting more and more difficult as the family gets spread over the world.
I'm going to be 80 come January, and they're some of my strongest memories. I really loved being in Sharon Springs for as long as I have, and being the sentimentalist that I am, I hope I can continue to keep the Brustman House going. Each year we manage to stage a reunion of our family members, many of whom have left for parts throughout America, and some have even gone overseas and are living as far away as China. And believe it or not, if they're at all able, they do come back year after year, and we have a gathering of between 20 and 30 people on a yearly basis, which I find wonderful. And though I'm, kind of devoted to the house, I feel that other people are feeling the same way. And it's really rewarding to see the gathering year after year.
Well, thank you, Richard and Henry, for such an informative program. I'm sure everybody really enjoyed that. And we'd like to thank everybody for your participation tonight. Before you leave, I just wanted to tell you about our upcoming program on October 11th. It's the Adler Hotel from Heyday to Present Day. It's a presentation about a hotel in Sharon Springs. It was the last hotel that was built in Sharon Springs. It was built in 1927. And it's a really interesting program that will show some home movies of when it was built and also show you what it's like present day, which is it's gone into a pretty advanced state of deterioration. So we hope you'll enjoy that program and join us on October 11th. And here's a listing of our upcoming programs. November 8th is They May Just Have Found James Tanner's Legs. That's a program by Pete Lindeman, and it's a book that he's written, and he'll be talking about various stories in that book. And then a great program on November 22nd. It's the assassination of John F. Kennedy 58 years later. And then in December, we have a program on the history of Santa Claus. So you won't want to miss that. And if you have any questions or comments, here's the way to reach us. There's our phone number and our email address, and our website address is at the bottom. This program has been recorded, and you will receive a link if you subscribe to our programs. You'll receive a link for each upcoming program, and then also a link for the pre-recorded program. So again, we'd like to thank you all for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed it, and have a great evening.